were talking about the extent of the magnitude of the issue of illegal sales and the ultimate disposition of FSC fish and the department's stance on that, at least. This is a document, Mr. Koltish, of a meeting from April of last year, the I&I working group. Do you recall this meeting or meetings of its type?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Mr. Nelson, I'm not sure I see your name on there. Were you at this meeting, do you know?
I don't believe so.
Okay. In any event, this is a meeting where the I&I folk, Mr. Koltish, got together to discuss key issues for investigation. Is that right?
This was a meeting intended to solicit requests for assistance from general duty staff for project-based activities that I&I would be involved in. We have a process where we request, or general duty puts in a formal request. We get together at this meeting over a 3-day period and then screen these requests and come up with a list of projects that I&I would then provide or work with general duty with regards to for the year. And that's what this meeting was intended to do.
If we could turn to page 6, please. And if we could just highlight the first third of the page. Under the heading Issues to Consider, the third bullet down, I see we had Williams in 2004, Project Ice Storm in 2005 with the assessment in 2006. We're now up to 2010. And that bullet reads 97% of FSC harvest in LFR, is that Lower Fraser River?
Yes, that's correct.
Is thought to be sold, DFO staff comments. First of all, can you tell me what the source of that number is?
Staff comments.
Okay, so which staff?
From the Lower Fraser.
Okay. CNP staff?
Yes.
Do you know what the source of their comments is, upon what they base that information?
Their activities and participation in investigations and enforcement on the Fraser for many years, as well as past activities by the Special Investigative Unit.
Okay, do you support this number as accurate?
I'd say it's pretty close.
Okay, and on what do you base your assessment?
Same criteria. We're working on the Fraser for many years, being intimately involved in projects and being a part of compliant enforcement activity on the Fraser myself as well.
Have you gone to First Nations to ask them if they're getting their FSC fish and eating it, or using it for social or ceremonial purposes?
Well, what was interesting is just a little history, and I'll try to be as concise as I can. When back in the early 90s, as a result of a Supreme Court of Canada decisions and challenges that were made on court cases, the department, as part of the reasoning, but rationale, introduced the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy and pilot sales opportunities for 3 geographical areas in the province. Prior to that, the sale of FSC fish or any fish harvested by First Nations under that was not permitted. As a result of that, the pilot sales opportunities were created, and allowing First Nations to harvest fish under communal licensing and sell. Now, as a result of that, there were a large increase of participants that came into the fishery who had not previously been a part of it. There were organized collection of fish and sales and so on through large through companies and so on that were now involved. So the marketing of the product, commercial marketing, went from very, very little to now substantial. And I remember being part of that process in the river and hearing and being approached by elders on some First Nations indicating that the nature of the fishery had changed, that they weren't getting their FSC fish anymore because the very people that were fishing for them were now fishing for commercial purposes, were selling, and all the fish were going for sale. And you know, being a part of the river myself, I've heard that many times. And I still believe that as a result of the increased ability to sell through legitimate has created marketing and processes now that are beginning to, or haunt us now when it comes down to FSC.
Mr. Nelson, we have a number here of 97%. Mr. Coltish, who heads the I&I division, has just told the commissioner he thinks it's fairly accurate. Do you accept that number as providing any sort of reasonable estimation?
It's from the Lower Fraser River, where
Yes.
I've only worked for a short bit of my career. I spent most of mine in the upper. Maybe I'll start comment about that, and then I'll come back to this. Like, in my experience in the Upper Fraser, there were some sales issues there as well, probably not as significant as this number, but I'll focus on the Lillooet area first. We've changed the policy. This goes back in the mid-90s somewhere. We used to seize fish and then dispose of them through taking them, if they were in good shape, taking them and going through a commercial plant and selling in the proceeds to the Crown, or keeping them for court purposes. What we started doing differently is taking the fish that were seized, if they're in good shape and good quality, and distributing them to the First Nations bands. We would actually go on the reserve with the load of fish we'd seized and distributed them. And we found that many people in the community had not got fish before that summer, even though there had been FSC fisheries, particularly some of the elders. And that was, I think, kind of a rude awakening for all of us, including the community, the First Nations community. And we did some work with them to, how can we address this? Because a lot of the illegal fishing tied into sales was from people outside their community coming in and fishing, and a lot of it was happening at night. So they came to us with a proposal to end nighttime fishing, and we followed up with that request, and the problem really diminished. So I think it's an example of we worked with them and reduced the problem. There still is some sales for sure, but I would say in the interior it's not anywhere near that number. I've heard it's high, very high down here, so I can't really say I'd stand behind that or say it's wrong. I'm not comfortable saying yes, it's 97%. I haven't worked in the Lower Fraser.
Given the information you're getting from Mr. Coltish and other staff and the information you got from Project Ice Storm, does the department have a handle on the sales issue at all?
Not an adequate handle on it, no.
Mr. Coltish, one of the, if we could mark this as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 871.
And just before we leave the sales issue, Mr. Nelson, without getting into them yet, I take it there are, and Mr. Coltish, I take it there are a number of challenges enforcing the sales provision, some of which you've alluded to.
Yes, and one of the other challenges obviously is what's causing people to do this is sometimes the deep-rooted social issues in communities. There are a couple that probably have those deep-rooted social issues more than other communities, and we struggle to work with some of them because of that. We've tried to get the attention of other agencies such as the provincial government, social services, and say, look, this community is in trouble. Let's try to get to the root of the real problems. It's not just about them wanting to sell fish. And it sort of got started, but then it kind of fizzled. But it was, we understand that sometimes the reason for these sales is not just for monetary. It's there's social issues in the communities that drive some of it.
Thank you. If we could have document 29, please. And if there's two parts, it's the second part that I'm looking for, the document as opposed to the email.
Thank you.
This is a document that was prepared by a member of your department, is that right, Mr. Nelson?
Yes.
And this is a document designed to answer two questions that were posed. The first, what is the department doing to address illegal sales issues in BC? And the second question, why do we still regularly hear complaints from the public about illegal sales of FSC fish, correct?
Yes.
And this document, I take it, sets out some concerns or challenges faced by the department in addressing this issue. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a fairly good summary, and I believe the final document was prepared by Paul Steele, Director General in Ottawa, with input from this region. I believe Dennis Burnup, who is an area chief that reports to me, was acting in my chair when this was actually compiled.
If that could be the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 872.
Mr. Coltish, with I take it there is a move towards an increased attention to Pillar 3 activities. That's major investigations. Is that fair?
Yes, that's correct. The federal government actually, or CREMP federally, has recognized the importance of intelligence-led program, both from a strategic perspective, that is an overarching program, but as well as the ability to tactically then focus in and go after high-value targets. That combined with the adoption of what we refer to as a major case management strategy, as well as implementation of several types of software that are now being implemented, both from a national as well as certainly within the region, is a move toward those programs.
Within this region and within I&I, intelligence-led policing, where do issues related to Fraser Sockeye fall on your list of priorities?
Well, certainly since 2005, with Williams funding applied, which provides the I&I group in the Fraser River as well as the others funding, it's considered to be a priority. However, in the last couple of years, we simply just haven't received or been able to engage in large, complex sales projects for a couple of different reasons, and that is competing priorities as well as just resources. Manpower and financial resources are, it's a very complex and complicated program that certainly can be done, but has to be done methodically. And we're hoping that the intelligence-led process with major case management will allow us to go back into the idea, or move back into the projects where we can target the high-value offenders versus the odd fisherman that has 10 or 12 fish.
Okay. And I take it mounting investigations like this requires manpower?
It certainly does, yes.
Okay. And Mr. Nelson, the movement towards more intelligent-led policing, does that mean a greater proportion of the resources and manpower will be devoted to the types of investigation Mr. Coltish was alluding to?
If there aren't additional funds, yes, it would have to come from within, just as some of the Pillar 1 activities that we've gotten into have drawn officers away from our regular patrol activity. The Pillar 1 activities, just for the Commissioner, are things that we do to improve relationships, education with all user groups.
And that's at the expense of bodies on the water doing traditional fisheries enforcement, for lack of a better
yes, but if it's a decision we have to make sometimes, because it's a better investment to, an example, Pillar 1, to get out there, build some relationships with the people and get them to understand what we're about, we understand what they're about, and work together on solutions. That's what Pillar 1 does. Pillar 3 is dealing with the small segment of any society that is going to break the law no matter what you do. And our goal is to try and reduce the number in that group and increase the number in the bottom group with Pillar 1 relationship building.
Okay. Fraser told you in '94 you needed a more credible staffing levels on the water. Williams talked about the need for a greater enforcement presence on the water. You've told the Commissioner earlier today that when there is a reduced number of uniformed officers on the water, that in your experience of 34 years, lack of compliance increases. How do you reconcile those considerations with a determination to move bodies from on-river positions to plainclothes duties and major investigations?
How do you reconcile?
Yes.
You do the best job you can. There's, there's an ever-increasing amount of pressures and workloads put on officers. And I'm at the stage now where I'm seriously concerned that the added stress to an already stressful job could create some health and safety concerns for officers and the public. We're at a point where we can't continue to expect changing a focus of how we address something to solve the problems. We're at a capacity, we're stretched beyond capacity as we are, and to expect that Intel-led is going to provide us solutions and directions. Yes, we might be able to focus on a few key large case investigations, but it will be at the cost of some of the local community things that are vitally important to try and maintain compliance. If all you do is, this is an extreme example, but if all we did was put all our attention towards major cases and aren't taking care of the softer approach items such as relationship building and just getting out there and being present, we wouldn't be doing a very good job with conserving Fraser River sockeye as well. So there has to be a balance, and I'm really concerned that the Intel model, there are probably people who think it's going to enable us to do the job with a lot less resources, and I don't share that view.
Mr. Koltish, I see you expressing an interest in responding, so please.
Mr. Commissioner, the struggle that Randy's described to us is a day-to-day issue that we struggle with when it comes to our programs and so on. I'll give you an example, though, with the RCMP. A number of years ago, the Mounted Police chose to move toward Intel policing simply because of the nature of what we were seeing with a variety of things. But let's look at the gang problems and the violence that they've seen. They started off with several analysts and now are at approximately 160 analysts that are a variety from intelligence to criminal analysts to threat assessment. And these people are civilian members. These are additions to the force. They're not police officers that have been converted or decided to be trained. What they've recognized is they've established what they believe to be is a minimal level of street presence patrol officers that they require to do their jobs. But instead of cutting into that and eating into that cadre, they had to sell it. They had to do the business plan. And they have. And virtually every law enforcement regulatory organization in Canada is doing the same thing, has gone the same way, understanding intelligence-led and major cases and so on. We're struggling with that, with the idea that not only within 176, but possibly down to 130 or more officers to do the type of work that we do. It is simply just, it is a real struggle to believe that we can do that effectively without giving up a significant part of what we do as an organization. That's where we're at.
Thank you, Mr. Koltish. Mr. Nelson, I'm going to move now to a different issue. It's still an enforcement-related one, and ask you about a couple of potentially challenging areas of enforcement. And I want to ask you first, sir, about what's come to be known as the mortally wounded clause. I wonder if you can just very briefly tell the Commissioner what that clause is and what your concern is with it.
One of the ways that resource managers deal with changes in fisheries is add a condition on licenses. And one of the conditions that is added several years ago, it was first started on the Fraser River, and it's a clause only in the FSC fishery that says if a fish is mortally wounded, they're allowed to retain it. So if, for example, the river is open for Chinook and there's a conservation concern for early Stuart sockeye, which are migrating at the same time, fishers go out, they're allowed to keep the Chinook, and if the sockeye is mortally wounded, they're allowed to retain it. And that clause is unenforceable. There is no way any expert in the world will be able to say that that fish coming over the side would have survived or not survived by them keeping it. So it's created and again, if everybody was a law-abiding citizen, it would be fine. But you take one or two people that start abusing it and keeping those sockeye, then everybody does. There were even examples in a dip net fishery in the interior where the mortally wounded clause was used. Well, in a dip net fishery, yes, the fish is going to lose some scales, but they're kept. And that clause is still prevalent in some of those fisheries, and it's expanding. Last year, the resource managers in the Johnson Straits, in a commercial fishery, were allowing the retention of prohibited species, and saying, well, they would be kept as FSC. So there's all sorts of problems that are created by it. But the main thing is, when a fish is in a net, some people might say it's mortally wounded there because it's lost so many scales. But certainly if it's released, it has a chance of survival. If it goes in the boat, it has no chance. So it's a clause that has been put in, and I know that in one area, the First Nations group has said it's not in their traditional beliefs and values. You shouldn't release something that is good food. I share that. It hurt. I've caught fish myself that were undersized and dead, and you have to release it. It's because if you don't, you've lost control of enforcing it. And so we're trying to get the message across internally within our organization, but there's so much pressure on the resource managers as well to try these new techniques. And I don't know how else to explain. Have I made it understood, Mr. Commissioner? I'm not sure, because it's a difficult one. But if a fish is in a net and comes over the side, we have had officers observe fishers pulling everything over the side. There's no attempt to revive anything, no attempt to release anything. And the officers have to stand there and realize that they can't do anything about it. That's the frustration. If the clause is changed and it reads something like every attempt should be made to revive a fish that is not be kept, at least some are going to survive. But it's one of the management conditions that seem to come along every once in a while and are instituted without thorough discussions with conservation and protection and the fishery officers. The fishery officers are out on the water and know better than anybody else about some of those conditions and what they might mean and being enforceable. If those discussions meaningful discussions had taken place internally, there may have been some input from the fishery officers that could say, hey, don't use those words, but perhaps these words to make it manageable. We want to work with them, but so often we see these conditions get implemented and put in place, and we come along after the fact to try and change them.
Mr. Commissioner, in the recreational fishery and commercial fishery, I'll speak to the commercial fishery as an example. In the Prince Rupert area, we have a migrating steelhead that are coming back through the mouth of the Skeena River. One of the techniques that is employed there is a reduced net length and soak time, and that is the amount of time that the net can be in the river. Every vessel in that area must have a revival box, and that is, if they encounter a steelhead, that fish through the gill net must be handled as carefully as possible, placed into the revival box with the intent of allowing that fish to recuperate from that and then released. In our recreational fisheries, where prohibited species or non-retainable species, we have things such as best handling practices and techniques, training videos and others that some of our sport fishing communities and others have adopted as best practices for fish handling. What these do is basically say you cannot retain these species, period. We want to try to save them as much as we can. This clause allows catch to be retained virtually under any circumstance and is creates a loophole such that in some cases hundreds of pieces can be kept for that reason.
And the ones that are kept are obviously the ones that are the most endangered stocks in under those conditions, license conditions.
Okay. Mr. Nelson, you've also addressed us about some concerns related to dual fishing. I wonder if you could just very briefly explain to the Commissioner what dual fishing is and what concern you identify in terms of enforcement and resourcing needed to enforce that type of a fishery.
This is another management tool that resource managers have used, and it involves commercial fishing at the same time or immediately before or after FSC fishing. So, for example, a commercial fishing vessel, and they tried it on a pilot last year in Johnson Straits with a salmon fishery. So a large seine, 2 or 3 large seine boats went out ahead of the commercial fishery to catch their FSC allocation. Bring it on board. Now the commercial fishery opens up. They fish for their commercial fish. Goes on the same boat in the same hold, and after it closes, they can continue fishing for FSC to within their allocation. Now, we from CNP said, look, you got to have a monitor on board every boat and document all these fish, and it's got to be followed right to where it's offloaded. That happened, but there were problems with it, and dual fishing is taking place currently in the halibut fishery. I know we're getting away from the Fraser River, but it's this management technique that is creeping into the fisheries where Fraser River sockeye are caught. I'll just describe briefly the halibut fishery. It's a hook and line fishery out in the ocean, where large lengths of line are put on with baited hooks to catch halibut. And the same technique was used in dual fishing. Like, okay, the person has an allocation, a quota to catch other halibut. They go out, they catch that. Okay, I've got all the halibut quota I'm allowed. Now I'm going to FSC, catch Aboriginal FSC fish. It can be a person that is designated by any band, and they'll go out and they'll continue to fish and catch an FSC allocation. Again, put on the same boat and brought in. Now, what's good about the halibut fishery is it has a mandatory landing program in place. So when the commercial halibut boat comes in, he has to have an independent monitor meets him at the dock, and they record and weigh the catch that comes off. So in these FSC fisheries, or with the FSC fish, they also recorded and documented that. So you think, great, we got a record of what was FSC. Now, it's incumbent on the First Nations band that is the alleged recipient of those fish to report it to the department. And the recent information that I got this week is that only 9% of the FSC fish was reported to the department. 9% was partially reported, and 82% was not even reported to the department. And that's with a good thing in place, like a mandatory landing program in place. So the idea of dual fishing is it's opening another door that's going to make it very, very difficult to do enforcement on without some very costly techniques to put in place, such as a person on board to account those fish.
Mr. Nelson, oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, let me see if I can just help summarize what I think your position is. There may be some efficiencies gained in terms of fuel cost and resources allowing dual fishing. Your concern is the amount of resources required from CNP to police that type of fishery and ensure that the rules are complied with. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and particularly the amount of catch. Like, it's important to get proper catch information. So
yes.
You would have to have some methods and some techniques in place that would ensure you're getting a proper catch and the enforceability of sales.
Thank you. I want to just ask you very briefly about the high seas drift net fishery. I take it the department's position, at least as articulated on its website, is that this problem is largely under control. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. This is You're aware that in recent years, as many as 25 and another year 47 boats were detected by overflights engaged in what appears to have been illegal drift net fishing in the high seas. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Even despite those numbers, is it your evidence that the problem is still under control?
Maybe I just try to do a brief history. Like, historically, there were two main fisheries out in the Pacific. One was a squid fishery and one was a drift net salmon fishery. They had hundreds of vessels involved, and at the peak, there was an estimated 2 million kilometers of nets in the Pacific fishing out there. Over the years, international agreements, those fleets have been eliminated, and there is a small, very small fishery out there now. It's monitored. International agreements, they're signatories to this, monitor it, and the numbers that you mentioned there, the 47, that were the number of vessels detected that could have been fishing illegally. It isn't the number that we're targeting on salmon. It's an unknown number of what they were fishing for. So that's the maximum amount of target vessels out there. So when you compare 30 to 40 to what were, 700-800 years ago, it's a small amount.
Thank you. I understand, and there's some information in the policy and practice report that you've seen about a fairly significant reduction in the number of Aurora hours. That's the plane used by Canada to police the high seas. Are you aware that there's been a significant reduction in the number of overflight hours?
Yes, there have been quite a significant amount in the Aurora hours. It has to do with the mechanical deterioration of old aircraft, the amount of aircraft that are available, and we are trying to deal with that in a way where we've approached Japan to get access to landing our aircraft in their country. And it's a very sensitive issue, obviously, landing a military aircraft in Japan. Those discussions are taking place. But if that's allowed to happen, it will mean a plane flying for 6 or 8 hours before they get to the patrol area will be much more efficient if they could land and access it from Japan. In other words, they're flying for a long time before they get to the patrol area. If they're able to land and overnight in Japan, then they're going to spend a lot more time patrolling the area. So, but the reductions are substantial.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson, I want you to sort of, at this point, I'm going to ask you sort of a broad question and ask you to address the Commissioner. I'm wondering if you can identify for the Commissioner what you would rank as your top, identify your most significant enforcement concerns at present. And those, when I say most significant, I mean those posing the greatest risk to the sustainability of Fraser sockeye.
I think there's a whole lot of things that could be done, but I guess recognizing the capacity needs, I hate to say that money's the first issue, but certainly capacity is not there. If we don't have that, we aren't going to gain much from this.
I'm just going to stop for a second. I am going to come to the question about what you think can be done about it. But,
okay.
But looking at each of the different fisheries, the recreational fishery, the commercial fishery, First Nations fisheries, what do you identify as the most significant enforcement lapses or enforcement concerns that are presently posing a risk to sockeye?
I'll do a couple, and then I'll ask Mr. Coltish for his thoughts too. But this whole idea of the cold storage, I think, in regard to the commercial fishery, addressing that issue, like how do we deal with that and make sure that we have proper traceability? We've started down that road, but I'd say proper traceability in the commercial fishery and catch reporting, making the catch reporting accurate, accurate in the minds of everybody, not just the resource manager and not just CNP. We've got to come together and find a way to get a better handle on what the catch is. In the FSC fishery, I would say allocations. It's an easy word to say, but to try and nail down what the number is that each particular band is going to require. Until you have that, it's so difficult to manage it. So I would say that's in the FSC fishery. That's one, and in it also the catch issues. The accuracy of the catch issues has to be raised up. In the rec fishery, a simple thing like making it mandatory that all salmon be recorded on the back of the license immediately might help us deal with some of the problems we see in the recreational fishery. Again, this is related to Fraser River sockeye. As it is now, only Chinook have to be recorded on the back of a license. Why not make it all salmon recorded on the back of a license? And if you fill the card up, then you go and get another one. And make it, I think there's a common theme among them all, is the catch. In order to properly manage any fishery, they've got to know what the amount is, in other words, what the allocation is in all of those fisheries, and you've got to have some confidence in what's being caught. And I think those apply to all of them. So Scott, do you have any?
I think from a compliance and enforcement issue, I think our focus has to be on targeting people who consciously decide to break the law, and the individuals or groups who are the primary offenders, particularly, and that applies to any fishery. But I would suggest that we need to continue to develop our capacity as an organization to target the chronic and or the commercial crime, organized crime offenders. Most of the First Nations people and commercial people and recreational people we deal with, by far the majority of them are good people. And sometimes those people get led astray, but there is a core group of people out there that simply are in it for themselves. They're in it for the monetary gain. They don't care about conservation, and in fact create problems for their own people. And those are the ones we have to go after.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson, just a couple of sort of brief questions to clean up a couple of things we touched on before. The first is the mortally wounded clause that you referred to. I take it that's not attached to every First Nations fishery license.
Oh, no. It's on some on the Fraser River and some in South Coast, but not anything in North Coast yet.
Okay. And not every one in the Fraser River, is that correct?
Oh, no.
Okay. Now, you made reference to the need for better catch numbers and a better understanding of what is being caught. We talked earlier about the recommendation from the Williams report, greater enforcement to avoid the concealing of overharvesting. And I think you've told us that CNP is not regularly involved in auditing catch numbers. Do you feel that CNP could have a greater role to play using its powers of inspection, auditing catch numbers? And if so, what's stopping that from happening?
I would go even further, not saying it could, it must. The only way we can get a true handle on the accuracy of all fisheries in the catch is having some kind of bring some rigor into an audit program that CNP has an involvement in. Now, when I say that, somebody immediately say, well, okay, here, go ahead and do it. But then it's this capacity issue. If you want us to do it, I'm sure fishery officers are willing to do it, but don't ask us to do it on top of everything else we have. And I just, a few examples on catch monitoring issues. You think, well, why are we so sure that the numbers aren't right? And I just have a few written down here, that a few issues that I know about. There was an example this past summer from Central Coast where 2 vessels came down to Johnson Straits to fish for sockeye. Some of them would have been Fraser River sockeye. They caught 23,000 FSC fish and returned home, and nobody in the department knew about it. Like, the resource managers didn't know they'd been caught. It was only when they got back and started distributing in the community that our officers got aware of it and went and checked on it. So when you hear numbers like that, it's a little scary. And then last year on the Lower Fraser River, in an FSC fishery, fishery officers did a patrol during a 2-day opening. So they went on the water for a patrol, which probably 4, 5, 6 hours, and they went on board the vessels and physically counted 123 sockeye. This was in very early in the season, so it's a small number, very small number. But they counted 123 sockeye, and when they returned, the area chief for the Lower Fraser went to resource management and said, "Here's a piece of information you might want to consider." And she said, "Oh, we've already calculated our catch, and we've come up with 113 as the entire catch for the full 2 days." And our officers had patrolled a fraction of the area in a small time period in a 48-hour fishery. And we're asked, the obvious question is, well, you have to adjust your numbers. Well, no, it doesn't fit the model. And it is very frustrating to see that happen. And that's not a unique example. That's happened in my experience over many years ago on the Fraser River. It still happens today where the direct information that we have, if it's pointing out some real deficiencies in the catch program that people in the department just do not want to recognize it sometimes. I know I testified at the last inquiry about an example where we were physically observing a fisher and asked a catch monitor to go find out what they caught. And they came back with a number of 25. And we said, no, go back again. We know it's greater than that. They went back and said 25. When we approached the site, we counted 275. So it's, these are probably big examples, or extreme examples, but if that's going on, there's no incentive for people to report, give us the right numbers in any fishery. If they're fishing to a quota or a number in any fishery, what's the incentive for them to be accurate to you? I'm going to tell them this number, and there's no consequence for that. So somehow we have to build some kind of a incentive system into the accuracy of these. There's just, again, it's something that I've seen over and over again in my career. If you talk to any officer in the region, you're going to see it. We need to have some rigor to the catch monitoring system. And I know there's people in the department who say we have some of the greatest catch monitoring in the world. Well, I know another example I told of recently in the East Coast in the crab fishery, where they have this monitoring system in place that was deemed to be very, very good.
No, I'm perhaps just going to stop you there.
Okay,
I wonder if we're perhaps getting a little far afield with the East Coast crab fishery example. Those are the questions I have. I understand you have some other recommendations that you'd like the Commissioner to consider, and I understand that your counsel is going to ask you about those and give you an opportunity to share them with the Commissioner before your evidence is concluded, so I won't duplicate that effort.
Thank you, Ms. McGowan. I would also ask if either you or your learned friend, if it's appropriate, just 2 points that were raised that could come back through their questions or your questions. One is, Mr. Coltish mentioned the federal policing program that is in place now with analysts that are being civilians retained, whether fisheries could rely upon federal police authorities, or do they have to duplicate, in essence, that kind of program within fisheries? And the other point is, I think Mr. Nelson touched on it, but I'm not quite sure if he fully touched on it. Here we are in 2011, and you talked about what the future holds. Has a full assessment been done by fisheries with respect to what in fact is needed, costing out the ultimate, perhaps with Plan B and Plan C? In other words, has a thorough analysis been done of, in fact, with all of the added responsibilities both of you mentioned with regard to Sarah and other areas, whether there has been an analysis done, in fact, in British Columbia, the region, what is in fact needed and what it would cost, just so we have some parameters here to work with. But I'm going to leave it with Mr. McGowan or his learned friend to draw that out as they ask their questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. And perhaps just before I sit down, then I'll I'll leave the first question you've asked so Mr. Spiegelman and I can discuss it over the lunch hour. But Mr. Nelson, perhaps you could just take a moment and address the Commissioner's second question. Given we have these added pressures which you've articulated here today and last time you were giving your evidence, and given what you've been told will be the end of the PIC fee money without any replacement, have you done an assessment of what that will mean for the department, and more importantly, perhaps, what you need in the way of resources and how they would be allocated to ensure a continued credible enforcement presence with respect to Fraser sockeye fisheries?
I have put together some numbers and information. It's fairly rough, and some of it may or may not be accepted by the department, but I do have a way to try and explain that.
Have you reduced it to paper?
Yes.
Is it a document that you could share with the Commission?
With a little cleaning up. I've got a lot of notes scratched on it and stuff, but I could provide something, yes.
Is it a document that you could clean up overnight and provide to the Commission tomorrow?
Yep.
I wonder if that might be an appropriate way, and then if there's further follow-up, I could deal with it in re-examination, Mr. Commissioner.
Well, yes, my preference would be that he provide it to you and your learned friend, and
Yes.
then you deal with it accordingly.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
My name is Jonah Spiegelman for the Council for the Participant Government of Canada. With me is my colleague Hugh McCauley. I note the time. We have about 10 minutes before the break, and I do think I have one discrete matter we can cover before the lunch hour, if that suits. Mr. Nelson, when you were here giving evidence on April 7th and 8th, you and Mr. Steele gave some evidence on the matter of unpaid fines. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And subsequent to giving that evidence, have you looked into that issue in more detail?
Yes.
So I have a few questions for you to help clarify the record on that matter, if that's all right. You indicated at that time that there's approximately $1 million in outstanding fines.
Yes.
And that you know that because you receive a quarterly report
Yes.
that sets out the outstanding fines. My first question is, from whom do you receive that report?
From Public Prosecution Services.
And am I correct in saying that your understanding of that total is that it's a rolling balance, in that in each quarter some fines are paid and additional fines are added?
Yes.
And are you aware that, or maybe I'll rephrase that, is it your understanding that some of those fines that are listed in that report are not yet due to be paid? Those are simply fines in the system that have not been paid.
There are probably some in there that get, yes.
And do you know the approximate time period over which those fines may have accumulated?
I know some of them go back to the early 90s, but I didn't really look through to see where the oldest one was.
So as much as 10 or 15 or 20 years,
Yes.
approximately? Thank you. And do you know approximately how many fines we're talking about?
Yeah, I was asked, and I said hundreds, perhaps low thousands. It's in the neighborhood of 17 or 1800.
And just for comparison's sake, do you know how many fishing licenses are issued each year in the Pacific region?
I don't know offhand commercial licenses, if Scott has any idea, but I know recreation licenses in the saltwater, 300,000 to 400,000, and probably a similar number in freshwater.
Okay, thank you.
Commercial licenses is in the low thousands in the region. I don't know the exact number.
Okay. Mr. Commissioner, I don't propose to tender those quarterly reports into evidence for a variety of reasons. One is which they contain the personal information of those people. I don't think that's, or it's our position that's not relevant. They're also very lengthy and ultimately not necessary. However, if Mr. Lund can pull up document 12 from Canada's list, that may be of some assistance.
Just while he's doing that, Mr. Spiegelman, I just meant to ask Mr. McGowan before he sat down, was the last document that you referred to with the witnesses marked as an exhibit? I can't recall. I meant to ask him at the time. It may have been, I just didn't make a note of it.
I believe that it was tab 29 of our list of documents, and I believe it was marked as Exhibit 872, Mr. Commissioner.
872?
Yes, I believe it was marked tab 29 as 872.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And I don't believe I went to a document after that, but I will. No.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Nelson, do you recognize the document that's up on the screen?
Yeah, this is a summary from the quarterly reports of how much is outstanding and how much has been paid on a quarterly basis.
Okay. And on the last 2 lines of this document, am I correct in taking that this is setting out how much has been paid over the period covered by this document?
Yes.
And so, reading from the document, since 2008, over $1 million has been paid in fines.
Yes.
Can I have that marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit 873.
Obviously, there would be a lot of fines that have been paid, or I don't know what that amount is.
Right. But the outstanding balance from each of these reports, the number's hovering around $1 million, but it's not that it's accumulating in every period, it's a rolling balance.
Yes.
On April 8th, Mr. Rosenblum and you had an exchange that I'll just quote from the transcript. If anyone is interested, it's at page 68, beginning at line 34. I'm not sure if it's necessary to bring it up or quick to do. So beginning at line 34 of that, Mr. Lunn, are you? Okay. The question posed to you was, can you tell me why that's happening, referring to the outstanding balance? Is it that there's no follow-up at the governmental end for collection, or is it a case of the court system not following up? Where's the problem? And your answer was, I'm not exactly sure, but I know we don't have a system to collect and follow up. That's the end of the quote. Mr. Nelson, do you have anything to add to that answer based on information you've learned in the past month or so?
Yes. What I wasn't aware of and should have been is that I was accurate in what I said there, in that we don't have a system to collect because it's the Public Prosecution Service's responsibility. What we do have, and I also wasn't aware of, we have a standard operating procedure which explains to fisher officers if you have something, a ticket that you wrote or a fine that was supposed to be paid by a certain date, contact the courts, find out if it's been paid. If it hasn't been paid, there's a procedure to follow to try send a letter or something, and then notify public prosecution that it hasn't been paid. And that's how they get added to it. Now, public prosecution, since 2009, have been making some focused efforts at recovering some of these fines. And they, I should back up. Where it involves a DFO license, like a commercial license, we can go to our licensing department and ask that when they come to renew their license, they pay the fine at that time, or they don't get issued the license. For most of the other fines, such as sport fishing licenses, we don't have that capability. But with the Public Prosecution Services, they can access Canada Revenue and get it added on to the person's income tax. In other words, if they have an outstanding balance, their amount of fine would be deducted if they have a refund coming. So there is a means to try and recover it.
Thank you. Mr. Lund, may I just have document number 1 from Canada's list, please? Is this the standard operating procedure that you were just referring to, Mr. Nelson?
Yes, and it actually is in the process of being updated, upgraded.
Okay. May I have that marked at the next exhibit, please?
874.
This would be a good place to break.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Thank you.
Now adjourned until 2 p.m.